The desperation that drove Felix Sparks was born in poverty. He left his life in Miami, Arizona, to ride the rails across the country, seeking work. His struggle was merely a prelude to the relentless, systemic demands of the war machine. His early success in Honolulu offered a glimpse of the law school future he desired. He parlayed a sharp entrepreneurial instinct into a substantial savings. But the escalating aggression of the Third Reich permanently deferred that dream. The attack on Pearl Harbor replaced it with the grim uniform of the U.S. Army. The shift from civilian life to soldier was jarring. It was difficult not just due to the sudden rigor, but due to the military's own systemic failures. The training at Pine Camp, New York, was a baptism by frostbite. Soldiers were provided insufficient winter gear. They suffered through temperatures that plunged to 54 degrees below zero. This lack of preparation extended into the field. The early training exercises were often a chaotic mess. It was a poor indicator of the methodical, lethal warfare they would soon confront. Amidst this turmoil, Sparks had sought an anchor. He married Mary Blair in the summer of 1942. Their relationship provided a fragile bubble of normalcy before the inevitable deployment. That emotional farewell in May 1943 was marked by a chilling reality. Their first child was due. Sparks sent a letter home instructing his parents to care for his newborn son should Mary not survive childbirth. Soon after, the 45th Infantry Division, the Thunderbirds, were loaded onto transports at Hampton Roads. The 2-week journey across the Atlantic was a monotonous, nerve-wracking existence of shared anxiety. It culminated in the transit of the Straits of Gibraltar under the shadow of the Rock. The invasion of Sicily, Operation Husky, was not the clean, textbook landing promised by strategists. As the massive fleet approached the coast, storm-whipped waters turned the disembarkation into a chaotic death trap. This classic Mediterranean mistral turned the initial landing at Bailey's Beach into a violent, uncontrolled descent. The landing craft were tossed violently by 9-foot surf. They were crewed by inexperienced coxswains who struggled to navigate the treacherous sandbanks. Men were weighed down by heavy packs and soaked uniforms. They were slammed against the metal sides of the boats. Many were dumped into the churning water and drowned before they ever faced a German bullet. The casualty reports from the first hours were grim. They detailed more losses from accidents and drowning than from enemy fire. The beachhead secured that morning was a testament less to military precision and more to sheer desperate survival. The campaign swiftly revealed a duality in the enemy. Initially, the advance was deceptively swift. Italian forces, demoralized and ill-equipped, frequently surrendered in droves. The easy capitulation of over 500 soldiers at San Croce Camarina offered a false promise of an easy campaign. But this soft underbelly quickly hardened. By the time the regiment had secured Comiso Airport, the face of the enemy had changed entirely. They now confronted the determined professional German forces. These were the Hermann Göring and 15th Panzergrenadier Divisions, who fought with lethal efficiency. This shift coincided with strategic friction at the highest levels. General Montgomery's demands for priority access to crucial coastal roads redirected the 45th Division away from key targets. This maneuver drew the ire of General Patton. Patton viewed Montgomery's cautious planning as an impediment to American prestige. While Patton fumed, the Thunderbirds were thrown into a grinding series of engagements against German delaying tactics. The heat of the Sicilian summer was overwhelming. The landscape was caked in dust that choked the men and coated their weapons. The fighting became intimate and savage. German snipers, masters of concealment, transformed the olive groves into deadly traps. Mortar shells fell with the deafening regularity of hail. The brutal engagements that followed, including the ferocious fighting at Bloody Ridge, left the men physically and psychologically shattered. They had entered the campaign as boys. The dust and blood of Sicily had irrevocably forged them into battle-hardened men. They now carried the indelible mark of the war's brutal human cost. For Sparks, the transition from desk duties to command was complete. He was forced to reckon with the immediate, visceral responsibility for the men whose lives now rested on his judgment. The invasion of mainland Italy, commencing in September 1943, was conceived under a dangerous illusion. Allied command assumed the capitulation of the Italian government meant the campaign would be an easy march up the peninsula. General Mark Clark severely underestimated the resolve and tactical genius of Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, the German commander. This strategic miscalculation was compounded by a crisis in American leadership. General George S. Patton, whose ambition had fueled the race for Messina, was abruptly removed from direct combat command. He was demoted to military governor of Sicily. The cause was two highly publicized slapping incidents in July, where Patton struck soldiers suffering from combat fatigue. The ensuing propaganda disaster left him paranoid and resentful. General Eisenhower likened Patton to a time bomb, holding him in reserve. The Salerno landings, Operation Avalanche on September 9, 1943, immediately exposed the brutal reality of the campaign. Driven by the flawed hope of surprise, Allied command waived pre-invasion bombardment. This left the initial waves of the 36th Infantry Division dangerously exposed. They hit the soft sands near Salerno only to be met by devastating, pre-registered German artillery fire at the men. The barrage sounded like a giant machine gun. The beachhead instantly transformed into a death trap. 200 men from the 36th Division alone fell in the first hours. Finding no safe retreat but the bullet-spattered sea, the invasion devolved into a desperate fight for survival. Captain Felix Sparks, leading E Company, experienced his first major combat deployment, leading his men ashore at Paestum. He fought his own rising fear, forcing himself to project the calm discipline necessary to keep his unit intact. The struggle to hold the beachhead was desperate. It culminated on Black Monday, September 13th, when German tanks massed for a breakthrough. Only relentless Allied artillery finally stalled the attack. But the victory was Pyrrhic. The campaign had devolved not into a swift advance, but a grinding war of attrition. They were fighting against Kesselring's newly established defensive lines, the formidable Gustav Line. The advance north was agonizing. The famous Italian autumn rains arrived, turning roads into glutinous bottlenecks. Rivers flooded, washing away the few remaining bridges. German engineers had meticulously mined every path and booby-trapped countless felled trees. Progress slowed to less than 2 miles a week. Near Ponte, in early October, Sparks faced intense machine gun and tank fire. It was during this brutal push that his trusted squad leader, Sergeant Vinnie Stigliani, was captured. Societies highlighted the grim personal toll of the relentless fighting. Sparks also lost his mentor, Colonel Ancorn, who was severely injured by a mine explosion. The conditions were monstrous. The men battled freezing temperatures, mud that clung to everything, and the onset of widespread trench foot. This debilitating condition sent thousands of soldiers off the line. To break this grinding stalemate, Operation Shingle, the Anzio landings, was launched on January 22, 1944. The American VI Corps landed over 36,000 men ashore by midnight. The operation was hampered by a critical lack of landing craft. Crucially, it was also hampered by the timidity of General John P. Lucas. Lucas failed to exploit the initial surprise. Instead of driving inland to seize the Alban Hills, Lucas paused to consolidate. This allowed Kesselring to react with terrifying speed. The beachhead became a static, heavily shelled enclosure, bitterly nicknamed the Bitchhead. Sparks and his men settled into the Padiglione woods near Anzio. By January 31st, E Company was committed to the front lines. They dug in near the Via Ansiate, the only major road leading inland. The Germans, 70,000 strong and including 10 divisions of armor, prepared Operation Fishfang, or Fish Trap, to destroy the Allied foothold entirely. Hitler had commanded them to fight with bitter hatred. The main assault commenced on February 16th. The German forces, some reportedly drunk and drugged, advanced bellowing orders and singing beer hall songs. The air was filled with the metallic scream of incoming shells. There was the whine of shrapnel and the crash of explosions. German armor, including lumbering 25-ton Mark VI Tigers and Mark V Panthers, pressed forward. The Thunderbirds, whom the Germans mistakenly perceived as racially inferior, fought fiercely. E Company was quickly reduced to barely 100 men. The moral and psychological limits of the soldiers were tested daily. Shrapnel accounted for nearly 80% of American infantry fatalities. Men dreamed of $1 million wound, one bad enough to get them home, but not bad enough to kill them. Amidst the chaos, medic Jack Turner was killed instantly while attempting to aid a wounded German officer. This act of compassion was brutally repaid. On February the 17th, hundreds of German soldiers closed on Sparks's position. Facing overwhelming numbers and the imminent collapse of his line, Sparks made an agonizing decision. They called in artillery fire directly onto his own positions, a measure known only as pulling the chain. This desperate measure, combined with the relentless, effective fire from Allied batteries, blunted the German advance. 600 enemy artillery rounds landed around Sparks and his men in a mere 40-minute spell. By the time a brief, desperate humanitarian truce was declared around 11 a.m. to evacuate the wounded, Sparks had lost over 100 men from the 230 he commanded. The fighting soon resumed, driving the survivors into the labyrinthine network of caves. These caves served as a command post and aid station. The caves became a veritable Hades, filled with bloodied stretchers. Men suffered from trench foot necessitating amputation. The pervasive stench of death filled the air. The defenders were critically low on ammunition. They resorted to stripping machine gun belts to refill rifle clips. Water became scarce, forcing men to drink a sickening blood-red fluid. When Lieutenant Colonel Sparks emerged from the caves on February 23, 1944, he was physically and emotionally done in. He was leading the exhausted survivors of the lost battalion. His battalion had suffered 75% losses. Upon reaching the regimental command post, the iron-willed commander collapsed. He slept for more than 24 hours straight, and the cumulative toll of the long nightmare in the mountains finally claimed him. Anzio had secured the beachhead, but only by transforming the men of the 45th Division into scarred survivors of a truly brutal crucible. The psychological scars, dubbed Anzio anxiety and Nettuno neurosis, were now indelible. The successful link-up between the forces trapped at Anzio and the advancing Fifth Army under Operation Buffalo finally ended the 127-day siege. The victory was immediately tainted by ambition. The path to Rome was now open. General Mark Clark, driven by a desperate hunger for glory and prestige, made a catastrophic decision. He ignored the explicit orders from General Harold Alexander to swing east and encircle the retreating German 10th Army. Clark instead prioritized a spectacular, self-serving entry into the Eternal City. On June 4, 1944, 2 days before the world's attention would be seized by the Normandy landings, Clark seized his prize. The capture of Rome was a monumental propaganda triumph. It was the first Axis capital to fall. Clark ensured he was the centerpiece of the press conference, declaring it a great day for the Fifth Army. Yet, among strategists and the men who had fought their way up the Italian boot, the celebration was muted. Clark's insubordination, his fixation on a photograph over a decisive military objective, was a colossal strategic blunder. By allowing the German 10th Army to escape relatively intact, he ensured the war in Italy would not end in 1944. Instead, he condemned the Allied forces to another year of brutal, grinding combat against a re-entrenched enemy. That year would cost tens of thousands of additional casualties. The focus of the war machine, however, had already shifted. Having bled out its strength in Italy, the 45th Division was pulled back. They were thrown into a new theatre, southern France. Operation Dragoon, launched in August 1944, was designed to open a second front. It aimed to draw German reserves away from the main Allied thrust in Normandy. Optimistically dubbed the Champagne Campaign, the initial landings at Saint-Maxime brought a brief, heady sense of triumph. The Provençal scenery was idyllic. They found pastel-shaded houses, tended orchards, and a joyful welcome from French civilians. Soldiers momentarily forgot the mud and blood of Anzio. They practiced their French and joked about the speed with which they could conquer the remnants of the German 19th Army. But the idyllic advance dissolved almost immediately upon reaching the rugged, unforgiving terrain of the Vosges Mountains. The campaign quickly transformed into a brutal war of attrition. The Vosges were a maze of closely bunched pine trees and thick, shrouding fogs. This landscape was perfectly suited for German delaying tactics. The advance became a crawl through a constant, damp tension. Soldiers found themselves in an eternal state of hypervigilance. Their nerves were frayed to the breaking point. They jumped at the slightest sound, mistaking a snapping twig or a sudden gust of wind for the movement of an unseen sniper. The fighting was terrifyingly intimate. The dense forest cover meant that tanks and artillery were often useless. Infantrymen had to get right on top of the goddamn Germans before engaging. This led to devastating small arms casualties. German 88mm guns and the terrifying Nebelwerfer rockets rained down shell fragments and deadly wood shards onto the exposed men. The incoming rounds sounded like a banshee-like scream. This prolonged, unrelenting exposure to violence broke even the strongest personalities. The psychological toll of Sicily, Salerno, and Anzio, compounded by the endless attrition of the Vosges, led to a systemic crisis of combat fatigue. The military euphemism was psychoneurotic breakdown. The reality was the disintegration of the human spirit. Soldiers developed the vacant, thousand-yard stare. The Aleutian stare. The man was present in body, but utterly absent in mind. The constant cold, the lack of sleep, and the pervasive fear meant that men who had survived years of combat suddenly reached their limit. Lieutenant Colonel Sparks, who had learned emotional detachment was necessary for survival and leadership, witnessed this collapse firsthand. He ordered one company commander, who had simply curled up and begun to cry uncontrollably, permanently evacuated. The statistics were stark. Over 100,000 men were pulled off the line for psychiatric reasons across the European theatre. The soldiers, far removed from the patriotic fervour celebrated back home, became profoundly cynical. The wartime slogan, "Home in 44, had morphed into a grim joke. Was the question now, stay alive in 45? They felt they owed their country nothing but their own survival. The war had ceased to be an heroic adventure. It was a grueling, psychological endurance test. The physical landscape of Europe was scarred. The deeper, more lasting wounds were carried internally by the men. They knew that the reality of the front line bore no resemblance to the sanitized victory being sold to the public. The mud, the cold, the blood, and the omnipresent, paralyzing fear were their only reality. The price of liberation was proving to be a debt that would haunt them long after the guns fell silent. That the strategic shock of the Battle of the Bulge was quickly absorbed by the ground troops. They recognized that the German Wehrmacht, far from collapsing, was capable of mounting a vast, terrifying counteroffensive. The winter of 1944 to 1945 became a season of annihilation. Across the Western Front, the fight was less about maneuvering and more about sheer survival against a foe driven by desperation and the pervasive terror of the SS. Even as the Soviets advanced in the east, Hitler launched Operation Northwind in the west. It was a final, furious effort to break Allied lines. It was in this crucible of freezing temperatures and fanatic resistance that Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks and his 3rd Battalion found themselves strategically betrayed. General Frederick, the division commander, had ordered Sparks to hold a critical ridge north of Reipertswiller, France. This decision, predicated on tying down German forces, quickly transformed a tactical objective into a catastrophic encirclement. The assault began at dawn, a maelstrom of violence unleashed by the SS. G Company, holding the forward position, was instantly overwhelmed. Flamethrowers seared the snow-covered earth. The rapid, terrifying fire of the German MG-42 machine guns, known to Americans as Hitler's buzzsaws, cut the 68-man company in half within minutes. The SS, some 200 strong, swiftly overran the position. They seized the greatest prize of all, an SCR-300 radio. This immediately gave them crucial intelligence on American movements and intentions. For the next several days, Sparks's men were isolated and exposed. The battlefield became an apocalyptic scene of shell holes and shattered trees that looked like snapped matchsticks. Driving sleet and heavy snow compounded the misery. They forced the cancellation of planned airdrops of vital supplies. The Thunderbirds, low on ammunition and food, were being steadily wiped out by the relentless SS advance. They faced the accurate, punishing fire of German Nebelwerfer rockets. Sparks, consumed by the knowledge that his men were being sacrificed, refused to accept the inevitable. Despite receiving orders to withdraw, and against the cautious counsel of his superiors, he requested tanks from Major Carroll. He was determined to lead a desperate rescue himself. He defied the chain of command, positioning himself in the turret of a Sherman tank. The troops had nicknamed the Sherman vehicle Ronson Lighter for its tendency to ignite when hit by German 88mm shells. As the tank lumbered up the icy supply trail, Sparks fired the machine gun incessantly. He engaged SS positions and dodged incoming Panzerfausts. His unwavering commitment was not lost on the enemy. During one particularly fraught moment, after his tank was damaged, He dismounted to personally rescue wounded men. The SS held their fire. Johann Voss, an SS veteran, later recalled this rare gesture as a recognition of a brave officer, but individual courage could not overcome the overwhelming strategic failure. The 158th Artillery fired relentlessly, dropping over 5,000 rounds in 48 hours. This was a shell every 6 seconds. But the dense SS defences and poor visibility made friendly fire a constant threat. By January 20th, the situation was hopeless. The SS issued an ultimatum for surrender. Minutes before the 5 p.m. deadline, the last radio message crackled through the static from K Company. The message was short. "They are attacking us." The final, desperate breakout attempt by K Company was crushed. The cost of holding the ridge was devastating. Sparks's battalion lost 7 company commanders, 30 platoon leaders, and 600 men killed, wounded, or captured. The SS took 456 enlisted men and 26 officers prisoner, and for the 157th Infantry Regiment, January 21, 1945, was the darkest day. It marked their first decisive defeat. The handful of able-bodied survivors, barely 100 men, voted against surrender, but the regiment was ordered off the line. Lieutenant Colonel Sparks was a shell of himself, utterly drained. Yet his iron will remained unbroken. He was consumed by survivor's guilt. Convinced he should have defied orders earlier to pull his battalion out, he sought out Brigadier General Robert Frederick in Metting and confronted him. Sparks demanded an investigation into the command decisions that had cost so many lives. Frederick, angered by this insubordination and perhaps fearing exposure of the strategic blunder, retaliated. He denied Sparks's recommendation for the Distinguished Service Cross. He claimed the colonel's actions were merely the duty of a commander, not extraordinary heroism. The personal vendetta was clear, but Sparks had made his stand. He had challenged the institutional cowardice that had cost his men their lives. He secured a profound, albeit painful, moral victory that would haunt his superiors long after the snow melted from the ridge at Reipertswiller. His battalion, battered, broken, and soon to be filled with fresh replacements, had made a heroic last stand. It earned the grudging respect of even the enemy, but it left Sparks with an indelible obligation to the hundreds who now lay beneath the splintered pines. The strategic landscape of early 1945 shifted with terrifying speed. The German offensive in the Ardennes had been stalled. The relentless pressure of the Allied armies, now fully mobilized and equipped, made the collapse of the Reich inevitable. On the Western Front, the great barrier to the German heartland was the Rhine River. For months, Allied forces had fought just to reach its banks. The extensive fortifications of the Siegfried Line, a 630-mile network of bunkers and tank traps built over 9 years, was intended to be the final impregnable defense. Yet in the face of the accelerating Allied drive, the Siegfried Line was breached in less than a week by 7th Army units. The true turning point arrived on March 7, 1945, at Remagen. As Lieutenant Karl Timmermann's company approached the Ludendorff Bridge, they saw a miracle. The bridge, scheduled for demolition, still stood, though visibly unstable. Timmermann, knowing the risk of it blowing in his face, made the hesitant but courageous decision to lead his men across. Moments later, the bridge exploded, but miraculously remained intact. It provided the Allies with a crucial early foothold on German soil. Within 24 hours, 8,000 Americans poured across the Rhine. They bypassed heavily fortified areas and shattered German expectations of a river defense. The crossing was a psychological as much as a strategic victory. It was symbolized days later by General George S. Patton's theatrical crossing near Oppenheim. Patton paused to urinate into the river and collect a symbolic sample of German soil. On March 26, 1945, Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks's reconstituted battalion crossed the Rhine near Worms. The feeling of victory was palpable, yet the advance into the fatherland brought them face to face with the utter devastation of German cities like Hamburg. There, fires had consumed entire districts, and corpses lay in the ruined streets. As they pushed deeper, the rationale for continued German resistance became tragically clear. It was no longer fueled by widespread ideological fervor. At the spring of 1945, the vast majority of Germans quietly reviled Hitler. Instead, their fight was born of terror. They were trapped between the advancing Soviets in the east, who were rumored to be enacting horrific vengeance. They were also threatened by the maniacal SS and Gestapo units in the West, who enforced resistance with swift, brutal executions. Sergeant Rex Rainey understood the dynamic. German soldiers fought because they were threatened with being machine-gunned in the back. Hitler, ranting from his underground bunker, had commanded a suicidal resistance. He threatened the destruction of the German people if they failed, spiraling the conflict into a vortex of nihilism. This fanatical resistance manifested most fiercely in urban combat. Decentralized command allowed local Nazi ideologues to compel soldiers to fight to the last man. The battle for Aschaffenburg, a beautiful ancient city in Bavaria, became one such grinding inferno. Sparks's battalion advanced on March 28, expecting the city to be secured. This was the result of a critical intelligence failure. Instead, they were met with a ferocious eruption of German small arms fire and mortar attacks. They had been cruelly deceived. Major von Lambeth, the fanatical German commander, enforced his defense with public executions. He hanged soldiers like Lieutenant Friedel Heimann for Fahnenflucht, or fleeing the flag, the local party ideologue. Kreisleiter Wohlgemuth amplified the terror. He demanded unlimited hatred for this cursed enemy. The fighting devolved into the most intense close-quarters combat Sparks had yet experienced. Snipers lurked in every window. Every house became a fortress. The soldiers moved through the streets, engaged in house-to-house battles. They relied on grenades, axes, and knives. The relentless German shelling sounded like a vicious hailstorm. Sparks's battalion alone lost 90 men in the fighting. The regiment suffered 200 casualties. The absurdity of war was briefly highlighted by the discovery of a warehouse. It was filled with over 1 million bottles of fine wine and liquor. This led to a temporary dark celebration, the creation of the 157th zombie cocktail, amidst the carnage. The battle only broke on Easter Sunday, April 1st, after American forces brought overwhelming force to bear.
This reportedly included the use of napalm for the first time in Europe on a civilian area.
As German defenders finally began to surrender, Colonel O'Brien issued an ultimatum. On April 3rd, Major von Lambeth, his pointless fanaticism exhausted, agreed to surrender. Sparks personally accepted Lambeth's capitulation, viewing the German commander's wasted effort with contempt. The battle resulted in the destruction of a magnificent ancient city, but it reinforced the Allied command's grim policy: immediate surrender or destruction. The Thunderbird caravan pushed south towards Bavaria, the symbolic heartland of Nazism. The advance was rapid, characterized by scattered resistance from desperate teenagers and old men. But the true, horrifying cost of the war was about to be revealed. On April 29, 1945, the mission changed abruptly. Sparks received new orders. He was to divert his task force from the primary objective of reaching Hitler's presumed mountain redoubt. Instead, he was ordered to secure a concentration camp near Dachau that afternoon. Lieutenant Bill Walsh of I Company led his scouts toward the coordinates. They found a road junction, and then the prelude to hell. John Degro, one of the scouts, discovered a train. It consisted of 39 boxcars packed with approximately 2,000 corpses. The stench was overpowering, a sickening, cloying miasma of death that made breathing itself difficult. The bodies were emaciated, many bullet-riddled, as Death Train had left Buchenwald 3 weeks prior with nearly 4,800 prisoners. It held only 800 survivors when it arrived at Dachau. The liberation of the Dachau complex commenced late that afternoon. As Walsh's company entered the camp, the horror was immediate and absolute. Walsh later confessed he broke down and cried. He was overwhelmed by the sight of skeletal, lice-infested inmates, packed into barracks designed for a fraction of their number. The systematic extermination shattered any lingering illusions of a clean war. Adding to the outrage was the stark contrast. The SS men, the perpetrators of this unspeakable evil, were found in the camp's infirmary. They were lying on clean white sheets, well-fed, while their victims were shuffling skeletons. The shock quickly curdled into a blinding, murderous rage. Soldiers vowed to take no SS prisoners. The systematic evil they confronted robbed the liberators of their reason.
They saw the emaciated, stinking corpses.
They saw the piles of bodies left to rot from typhus. They saw the crematorium where up to 150 men were put to death daily. In the camp's coal yard, The rage boiled over. Approximately 100 SS men were lined up against a wall. A cry went up, and gunfire erupted. At least 17 SSS men were killed instantly, with dozens more wounded. Soldiers and liberated inmates alike opened fire. Lieutenant Walsh, witnessing the scene, famously declared, "Let them have it." Colonel Sparks, racing back toward the sound of the unauthorized execution, arrived at the coal yard wall. They saw men descending into madness. The line between justice and barbarism was collapsing under the weight of the atrocities witnessed. Drawing his .45 caliber pistol, he fired a single shot into the air. He commanded, "Don't move." He intervened forcefully, asserting military discipline to stop the massacre. He prevented a larger slaughter and confronted the moral crisis head-on. The scenes at Dachau were an indelible scar. They left Sparks with a lifelong obligation to the men who had been forced to confront the dark heart of Nazi Germany, that had stopped them from being temporarily robbed of their own humanity. The German surrender, signed at 2:41 a.m. on May 7, 1945, brought an official end to the European conflict. For the men of the 45th Division, VE Day was not a moment of ecstatic release, but one of quiet, profound exhaustion. For the American public, it was jubilation. For the soldiers, it was a moment of reckoning. Audie Murphy's observation captured the sentiment perfectly. There is VE Day without, but no peace within. Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks carried the weight of his 500 bloody days of combat. He felt an obligation to the hundreds killed under his command, half of whom were now buried in European soil across 2,000 miles. The immediate aftermath was defined by bureaucratic turmoil. Sparks's fierce intervention at Dachau to stop the massacre of SS prisoners had placed him in the crosshairs of the command structure. They believed the act was his moral duty. General Frederick, fearing the political fallout and the stink of the Dachau shootings, abruptly reassigned Sparks. He ended his command in Europe and sent him home to prepare for the invasion of Japan. Though Sparks departed with the internal conviction that he had done the right thing by stopping the madness, the official investigation into the unauthorized killings continued in Bavaria. These potential war crimes were committed by the liberators themselves. That investigation, led by Lieutenant Colonel Joseph M. Whittaker, collected sworn testimony. It detailed the 17 dead Germans in the coal yard and the dozens of brass casings left behind, and gave him both matters with swiftly and decisively quashed. By a higher authority, General George S. Patton, now commanding the Third Army, read Whittaker's report. With characteristic bluntness, he dismissed the entire affair as chicken shit. Patton tore up the papers, declaring Sparks a damn fine soldier. He shielded the Thunderbirds, who had suffered staggering casualties in 511 days of war, from further scrutiny. The charges were dismissed, but the moral burden was not. Sparks returned to New York Harbor in August 1945. The sensory explosion of the city, the honking cabs, the music, the sight of the Statue of Liberty, was a jarring contrast to the silence of the trenches and the stench of Dachau. The war had followed him home. He suffered from severe post-traumatic stress, mistaking the innocuous buzz of a power line for the metallic scream of incoming shrapnel that carried the indelible psychological scars of the conflict. He was haunted by recurring nightmares and the guilt of lost men, acknowledging that he had never recovered from their loss. The immense cost of war, regardless of military success, was too great. He returned to a life that felt foreign. His 2.5-year-old son, Kirk, was nearly a stranger. The attempt to bond was difficult, a struggle mirrored by countless veterans who found that the war had stolen the easy intimacy of family life. Sparks and his wife Mary settled into the primitive trailers of Vettsville in Colorado, lacking basic amenities. Yet, driven by the need to find purpose beyond the battlefield, he pursued his law degree. This was an effort to rebuild his life and mind through structure and intellect, established a successful law practice, eventually serving as district attorney and being appointed to the Colorado Supreme Court. His resilience, the ability to never give up, had counted most. It was a spirit forged in the crucible of war. For decades, however, the Dachau controversy persisted. The false narrative, amplified by books like Howard Buchner's Dachau Hour of the Avenger, accused Sparks and his men of cold-blooded mass murder. Sparks, who had spent his life fighting for integrity, was pained by the implication that he was anything less than honorable. The vindication arrived in the early 1990s. not through official channels, but through the dedicated work of Jewish World War II veteran and researcher David Israel. Israel's search for the truth led him to Robert Goebel, a Signal Corps photographer. Goebel had